The air in the dusty farmyard was thick with the scent of apple blossoms and dry earth, a peaceful smell that felt like a cruel joke. For 12-year-old Daniel Tobias Ashworth, it was the end of the world. After a journey of 140 miles on foot, a pilgrimage that had shredded the soles of his feet to raw, weeping flesh, he could barely stand. His eyes, blurred with exhaustion and unshed tears, scanned the property until they landed on the orchard. There, beneath a tree laden with white flowers, was a small patch of freshly turned soil. A simple wooden cross, no bigger than his forearm, was pushed into the dirt. Even from a distance he could read the name carved into the wood: Abigail, his sister. The sight didn't just break his heart. It vaporized it, turning the hope that had fueled him for 6 agonizing days into a fine gray ash that settled in his lungs, making it impossible to breathe. He collapsed right there, the Kansas dust rising in a cloud around him, his journey over, his promise met with the devastating silence of a grave. This is a story about a promise that stretches across impossible distances and a love that refuses to be extinguished by cruelty or even by death. If you believe that a single act of kindness can change a life and that some bonds can never truly be broken, then I ask you to join us for this journey. Let us know in the comments where you're listening from today, and consider leaving a like to show your support. Make sure to subscribe to our channel, because I promise you, the story of what happened in that orchard is not just about an ending. It's about a beginning that will stay with you long after the final word is spoken. The heartbreak you feel now is only the first step, and the destination is worth every moment of the path we are about to walk together. But to understand why this small, quiet grave in the heart of Kansas represented not just a tragic conclusion, but also the start of a profound legacy, we must go back. We have to rewind the clock 3 months and 6 days, leaving the scent of apple blossoms behind for the coal smoke and steel clamor of a train platform in Dodge City. We must return to that chaotic spring afternoon in the year of 1891, to the precise moment Daniel's world was violently cleaved in two, the moment his sister's tear-streaked face disappeared behind the glass of a departing train. It was there, amidst the shouts of cattlemen and the hiss of steam, that his impossible journey truly began. Born from a desperate promise whispered to a girl he was terrified he would never see again. 12-year-old Daniel Tobias Ashworth existed in a world defined by the narrow confines of a 6th-floor tenement room in New York City, a space that smelled perpetually of damp wool, boiled cabbage, and the faint, ever-present bitterness of coal smoke that seeped through the window frames. 3 months before the train, before the endless Kansas sky, his universe was a geography of survival, mapped out in the cracks on the plaster ceiling and the worn hollows of the floorboards. He was a boy shaped by responsibility, his shoulders already carrying a weight that had little to do with his lanky frame, and more to do with the constant low-grade hum of anxiety for his younger sister, Abigail. At 8 years old, she was a small, fragile flame he was determined to keep from being extinguished by the city's unforgiving drafts. His baseline emotion was not happiness or sadness, but a quiet, vigilant watchfulness, the state of a soldier on a lonely outpost, guarding something infinitely precious. Their parents were ghosts in their own home, spectral figures who left before dawn for the factories and returned long after dark, their faces smudged with soot and exhaustion. They were not cruel, merely absent, consumed by a relentless cycle of labor that left little energy for anything but a few weary words and a shared meager meal. This absence created a vacuum that Daniel had learned to fill. He was the one who ensured Abigail ate her portion first, who tucked the thin, scratchy blanket around her at night, and who used his own body as a shield against the chilling winter air that crept through the walls. Their bond was not forged in shared joys or family outings, but in the silent, shared understanding of 2 children clinging to a raft in a vast, indifferent ocean. Daniel's love for his sister was his one true north, the single point of certainty in a life of profound instability. The city outside their single window was a constant roaring beast. Its symphony was composed of the clang of trolley bells, the shouts of street vendors, the distant wail of a steamship horn from the harbor, and the incessant rumble of wagon wheels over cobblestones. For Abigail, these sounds were often frightening, sources of unseen monsters in the gathering dusk. But for Daniel, they were a reminder of the world he had to keep at bay. He learned to interpret the city's moods through its sounds, knowing the sharp, angry shouts that signaled a brawl in the alley below, or the hurried, frantic footsteps that meant the police were chasing someone through the crowded streets. His role was to be the filter, to stand between the harshness of that world and the innocence of his sister, translating the city's roar into something less terrifying, a story or a game that could distract her until she fell asleep. Life was measured in small, precious victories. A salvaged apple, bruised but still sweet, became a shared treasure, divided with the meticulous fairness of a king distributing his fortune. A rare afternoon when their mother returned with an extra loaf of bread felt like a banquet. These moments were islands of light in a sea of grey. Daniel's most potent weapon against the encroaching despair was his imagination. He would steal discarded newspapers and, by the flickering light of a single candle, spin tales from the headlines. A story about a ship sailing to China became an adventure where he and Abigail were stowaways on a grand vessel, searching for a land where no one was ever cold or hungry. He built castles for her out of words, fortresses of hope in the cramped, cold reality of their room, each story a whispered promise of a better world he desperately wanted to give her. Their daily routine was a ritual of survival, a testament to the resilience of childhood. Mornings began not with the sun, but with the shivering cold that seeped from the floorboards into their bones. Daniel would rise first, his breath a white puff in the dim light, and check on Abigail, ensuring the blanket hadn't slipped off her small form. He would break off a piece of stale bread for their breakfast, his own stomach a tight knot of hunger he had learned to ignore. The day was a long, slow passage of time spent within the four walls of their room, as their parents had forbidden them from playing in the dangerous streets below. They played quiet games with pebbles and string, their world shrinking to the size of a floorboard. Yet in those moments, with his sister's laughter filling the small space, Daniel could almost forget the gnawing emptiness in his belly. Abigail possessed a quiet strength that mirrored her brother's. Where he was the stoic guardian, she was the keeper of their small joys. She owned a single precious doll, its porcelain face cracked and its dress a patchwork of salvaged rags. But she treated it with the reverence of a queen. She would create elaborate lives for this doll, whispering its secrets to Daniel, and in doing so, she reminded him that even in the bleakest of circumstances, there was still room for tenderness. Her unwavering belief in the stories he told, her complete trust in his protection, was both his greatest burden and his most profound source of strength. He was not just her brother, he was her hero, her storyteller, her shield, and he knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his marrow, that he would do anything to keep from failing her. The tenement itself was a living, breathing entity, and it was unwell. Its timbers groaned under the weight of too many lives. Its hallways smelled of decay and unwashed bodies, and its walls were thin as paper, carrying the sounds of a dozen other families living lives as desperate as their own. Daniel often lay awake at night, listening to the symphony of their shared existence. A baby crying in the apartment below, a violent argument erupting from across the hall, the sound of a man coughing, a deep, rattling cough that never seemed to end. He was acutely aware of their fragility, of how easily their small world could be shattered. This wasn't a home, it was a temporary shelter, a place where families clung to the edge, praying the wind wouldn't blow too hard and send them tumbling into the abyss. One of their few shared possessions was a small, tattered book of fairy tales, a gift from their mother from a time before the factory had stolen the light from her eyes. The pages were soft and worn thin from countless readings. The illustrations faded to pale ghosts of their former vibrancy. This book was their most sacred object. On the coldest nights, when the wind howled and the building seemed to sigh around them, Daniel would read to Abigail from its pages. He would use different voices for the brave knights and the cunning witches, his voice a low, soothing murmur that fought back the darkness. The stories were always about escape, about children lost in dark woods who find their way to a cottage made of candy, or a princess locked in a tower who is rescued by a determined prince. They were tales of hope, and Daniel clung to them as fiercely as his sister did. A palpable fear, Unspoken but always present was the threat of fire. In a building made of old, dry wood, crowded with families using coal stoves for heat and candles for light, disaster was a constant, lurking shadow. A few months prior, a fire had broken out on the second floor, and the entire building had filled with the acrid smell of smoke and the sounds of panicked shouting. They had been lucky that time. The fire was small and quickly extinguished, but the memory lingered. Daniel would sometimes find himself sniffing the air, his body tensing at any unusual scent. He began to plan, in the quiet, methodical way of a boy forced to think like a man, what he would do if it happened again. He knew which floorboard creaked the least, and he mentally mapped the path to the fire escape, his primary objective always the same: get Abigail out. He had a recurring dream, or perhaps it was a waking nightmare. In it, he was running through an endless dark hallway, his sister's hand clutched tightly in his own. The air grew thick with smoke, and her grip would begin to slip. He would tighten his hold, his knuckles white, his entire being focused on the single desperate task of not letting go. He always woke up just as he felt her fingers sliding from his heart pounding against his ribs, and a cold sweat slicking his skin. He would immediately reach out in the darkness to find her, his hand resting on her small back, feeling the slow, steady rhythm of her breathing until his own heartbeat returned to normal. The dream was a manifestation of his deepest terror, the fear of being separated from her, of being unable to protect the one person who gave his life meaning. The social fabric of the tenement was a tapestry of quiet desperation and fleeting kindness. Neighbors would sometimes share a bit of coal or a pot of thin soup, small acts of solidarity in the face of overwhelming hardship. But there was also a darker side. The landlord, a man with a perpetually sour face and a ledger book he treated with more care than any human being, who would threaten eviction for a single day's late rent. Daniel saw the fear in his parents' eyes whenever the man came to collect. He saw how they seemed to shrink in his presence. This man was the physical embodiment of the oppressive system that held them all captive, a constant reminder that their existence was conditional, their home a privilege that could be revoked at any moment, casting them out into the unforgiving streets. Daniel's world was a study in stark contrasts. It was the biting cold of the room versus the fierce warmth of his love for Abigail. It was the gnawing hunger in his stomach versus the richness of the stories he created to feed her spirit. He lived in a state of constant low-level grief for a childhood he knew he was missing. For a life of warmth and security, he could only glimpse in the pages of their fairy tale book. He didn't know what it felt like to be carefree, to run through a field of grass, or to fall asleep without the gnawing worry of what the next day would bring. His childhood had been compressed into a single solemn duty, to be the rock his sister could cling to in the storm. He carried a specific memory, a small perfect moment from the previous summer, that he held onto like a talisman. Their father had come home early one day, a rare occurrence, carrying a small paper bag. Inside were 2 bright red pieces of hard candy. For a few minutes the grim reality of their lives had receded. They had sat on the floor, the 3 of them. As Abigail's laughter echoed in the small room, a sound so pure and joyful it felt like a prayer, Daniel remembered the sticky sweetness on his tongue and the look of unadulterated happiness on his sister's face. That memory was his proof that light could exist, even in the darkest of places. It was the before he would later cling to, the memory of a time when his family, however fractured, was still whole. On that final afternoon in March, the air in the room felt unusually heavy and still. A strange, oppressive silence had fallen over the building, a stark contrast to the usual cacophony of life. Daniel was trying to mend a tear in Abigail's dress with a clumsy needle and thread, his brow furrowed in concentration. She was humming softly to her doll, a simple, meandering tune. Outside, the sky was the color of slate, threatening a late spring snow. There was nothing to suggest that their world was about to be consumed by fire, nothing to indicate that in a few short hours they would be orphans, their lives irrevocably shattered. There was only the quiet intimacy of a brother and sister, finding refuge in each other, unaware that the creaking floorboards and the ever-present smell of coal smoke were about to become the prelude to their greatest tragedy. The transition from the tenement's ashes to the vast, merciless expanse of the Kansas plains was a journey into a different kind of hell. For 3 months, Daniel's life became a brutal rhythm dictated by the rising sun and the whims of Horace Kellerman, a man whose heart seemed to be carved from the same hard, unforgiving rock as the land he ruled. The ranch was a sprawling prison without walls, where the endless sky felt more like a lid on a coffin than a symbol of freedom. Daniel's days were spent in grueling labor, his body shrinking from malnourishment, while his hands and back grew hard with calluses. The memory of Abigail's face, once a sharp, painful image, had begun to blur at the edges, worn down by exhaustion and despair. The constant gnawing worry for her had settled into a dull, permanent ache in his chest, a ghost limb he could always feel but never touch. Horace Kellerman's cruelty was methodical and deliberate. He saw the boy not as a child, but as a piece of livestock, something to be worked until it broke. The beatings were not born of anger, but of cold, calculated control, administered for infractions as minor as spilling a bucket of water or not working fast enough. Every night, Daniel was locked in the barn, the heavy wooden bar sliding into place, a sound that sealed his world into darkness. The first thing Kellerman had done upon their arrival was confiscate his boots, a simple act that was devastatingly effective. Without them, Daniel was tethered to the ranch, his world reduced to the distance he could walk on the sharp, sun-baked earth before the pain became unbearable. It was a constant physical reminder of his captivity, a strategic cruelty designed to extinguish any spark of defiance before it could ignite. His promise to Abigail had become a silent, desperate prayer whispered into the dusty darkness of the barn each night. It felt less like a plan and more like a fairy tale he told himself to survive, a fragile shield against the crushing hopelessness of his reality. He had no information, no map, and no idea where the train had taken her. She could be in the next county or 1,000 miles away. A ghost lost to the vastness of the American West. The lack of knowledge was a unique form of torture, leaving his imagination to fill the void with terrifying possibilities. He pictured her alone, frightened, believing he had abandoned her. This thought was a torment worse than any of Kellerman's beatings, a wound that festered deep within his soul. The turning point arrived on a Tuesday afternoon in late June, under a sky the color of bleached bone. The air was thick with heat and the smell of dry grass, and the world seemed to shimmer in the oppressive sunlight. Daniel was mending a fence at the far edge of the property, his fingers clumsy and raw from wrestling with the sharp wire. It was monotonous, painful work, and he had retreated into the numb, mechanical state that allowed him to endure the days. He was so focused on the task, on the simple rhythm of stretching and tying, that he barely registered the sound of approaching horses until they were nearly upon him. 2 drovers, their faces caked in dust and their clothes stained with the grime of a long journey, had stopped to water their horses at a nearby trough, their presence a rare intrusion into Daniel's isolated world. He kept his head down, his body tensing, trying to make himself as small and unnoticeable as possible. Strangers were a variable he couldn't control, and any unexpected event often ended with him paying a price. He could hear their low voices, the words indistinct at first, muffled by the sound of the horses drinking greedily. They spoke of cattle prices and the lack of rain, their conversation the mundane litany of men who lived their lives on the trail. Daniel focused on a stubborn knot in the wire, feigning an absorption in his work that he did not feel, his entire being on high alert. He just wanted them to finish their business and leave, to let the oppressive, predictable silence of the ranch return. He had learned that invisibility was his only form of safety in this harsh, unforgiving place. Then, a single phrase cut through the afternoon haze and struck him with the force of a physical blow. One of the men, a grizzled character with a tired voice, mentioned the last Orphan train that had passed through the territory. Daniel's hands froze, the wire slipping from his grasp. He remained perfectly still, his head bowed, but his attention was now laser-focused on their conversation. Every nerve in his body strained to catch their words, his heart beginning a slow, heavy drum beat against his ribs. It was the first time in 97 days that he had heard any mention of the system that had stolen his sister, the first crack of light in a seemingly endless cavern of darkness. The world around him seemed to fade, the buzzing of insects and the heat of the sun dissolving until only their voices remained. The man continued, complaining about how the program brought nothing but trouble. But then his partner chimed in with a different story. He spoke of a kind Methodist family he knew, the Whitmores, who lived up north near a place called Cottonwood Falls. He said they had taken in a little girl from that last train, a small, sickly thing who had arrived with a terrible cough. Daniel's breath caught in his throat, a painful, ragged gasp he struggled to suppress. And then the man said the name, a simple, casual utterance that shattered Daniel's world and rebuilt it in the space of a single heartbeat. He said the family called the little girl Abby. The name, her name, hung in the hot, still air, and for a moment Daniel felt the ground shift beneath his bare feet. It was a miracle, a word dropped from the sky. In that instant, the abstract, formless threat that had haunted his every waking moment solidified into a clear and terrifying reality. The true danger wasn't Kellerman's cruelty or the constant hunger. It was time. It was the slow, steady erosion of his sister's faith in him. The drover had described her as sickly, a detail that sent a fresh wave of panic through him. Every day he remained a prisoner on this ranch was another day she might be suffering, another day she might be feeling utterly alone, another 24 hours for her to believe that her brother, her protector, had forgotten his promise. The vague sorrow of their separation was replaced by a sharp, urgent terror. He now had a destination, a name on a map he didn't possess. The distance, which the man had casually estimated as about a week's walk, was no longer an impossible void, but a measurable challenge. The drovers finished their conversation, mounted their horses, and rode away, completely unaware that their idle chatter had just ignited a revolution in the heart of the silent, ragged boy mending the fence. Daniel watched them disappear over the horizon, their forms shrinking until they were swallowed by the vastness of the prairie. He stood there for a long time, the fence forgotten, the afternoon sun beating down on his head. The fear was still there, a cold knot in his stomach, but it was now joined by something else, something fierce and powerful. It was resolve. He was no longer just a victim enduring his fate. He was a brother with a mission. The threat was no longer separation. It was failure. And failure was not an option. He returned to his work, his movements now precise and deliberate. His mind, however, was no longer on the wire. It was racing, calculating, planning. He was seeing the ranch not as his prison, but as the first obstacle to overcome. He noted the position of the sun, the length of the shadows, the distant barking of the dogs near the main house. The world, which had been a grey landscape of suffering, was suddenly filled with details, with potential tools and escape routes. The conversation he had overheard was more than just information. It was a key. It had unlocked the cage of his despair and transformed him. The boy who had been slowly dying inside was gone, and in his place was someone with a singular, unshakable purpose: to walk north. That night, locked in the familiar darkness of the barn, the world had been fundamentally remade. The drover's words echoed in the suffocating silence, not as idle gossip but as a prophecy and a map. Cottonwood Falls, Abbey. The names were no longer abstract concepts. They were a destination and a purpose, a tangible point on a compass that had, for 3 agonizing months, spun uselessly in the void of his despair. The vague, sorrowful promise he had whispered to himself each night transformed into a concrete, terrifying mission. He would go north. The decision wasn't a debate or a consideration. It was a chemical reaction in his blood, an instinct that overwhelmed the exhaustion and the fear. The question was no longer if he would leave, but how he would survive the first 100 yards. He lay in the straw, his heart a frantic drum against his ribs, and for the first time since the fire, he felt the sharp, painful, and undeniably potent sting of hope. The sheer scale of his decision settled upon him like a physical weight, threatening to crush the newfound resolve before it could even take root. He had no shoes. His only food was the memory of the meager dinner he'd already eaten. He had no map, only a direction, north, and a name whispered by a stranger. The prairie was a vast, unforgiving ocean, and he was preparing to set sail in a leaky boat with no paddle. A wave of cold, paralyzing fear washed over him, so intense it made his teeth chatter. He thought of Kellerman, of the man's cold eyes and the casual cruelty in his hands. He imagined being caught, the brutal punishment that would follow, a beating from which he might not recover. The fear was a living thing in the darkness with him, whispering of failure, of pain, of a lonely death under the indifferent Kansas sky. He squeezed his eyes shut and summoned the one image that could fight it. Abigail's face, tear-streaked behind the train window, her eyes pleading with him not to forget. That memory was his shield. Fueled by that vision, he moved. The barn, for so long his cage, now became his command center. He scrambled up the rough-hewn ladder to the hayloft, his bare feet finding familiar purchase in the dark. The air up there was thick with the sweet, dusty scent of dried alfalfa. He crawled to a wide crack between two wall planks, a vantage point he'd previously used only to watch the stars and dream of another life. Now, it was a sniper's nest. He pressed his eye to the opening and began to study the ranch yard, his prison, with the intensity of a general planning a campaign. He memorized the layout of the buildings, the shadow cast by the water trough, the exact location of the kennel where Kellerman's two dogs slept. He watched the main house, a distant square of faint yellow light, and waited, his breathing shallow, for that final light to be extinguished, signaling that his captor was asleep. Time stretched and warped in the silent observation of the loft. An hour passed, then another. Finally, the lamp in the house went out, plunging the entire farmstead into the pale, silvery light of a waning moon. This was his chance. He slid down the ladder, his movements now imbued with a stealth he hadn't known he possessed. His first objective was sustenance. He crept to the corner where he had left the tin plate from his dinner. A small piece of hard, stale bread remained, no bigger than his palm. He had saved it, a habit born of constant hunger, but now it felt like a provision from fate. He carefully wrapped the precious morsel in a scrap of burlap. He tore from a feed sack, the rough texture a comfort against his skin. It was a pathetic ration for a journey that might take a week, but it was more than he'd had a minute ago. It was a start. His next thought was water. The trough in the yard was too exposed, too close to the dogs. His eyes scanned the deep shadows of the barn, searching, hoping. Then he saw it, a rusted, forgotten canteen hanging from a nail near the horse stalls, likely left behind by a hired hand years ago. It was a small miracle. His heart hammered against his ribs as he moved towards it, each step a calculated risk, his bare feet silent on the dirt floor. The barn was a symphony of quiet sounds, the soft snuffling of the horses, the rustle of a mouse in the hay, and he prayed his own movements would blend into the chorus. He unhooked the canteen, its metal cool and solid in his trembling hands. Working with painstaking slowness, he filled it from the large barrel of water kept for the horses, the liquid tasting faintly of algae and rust, but to him it was the taste of life itself. Clutching his meager supplies, he retreated once more to the relative safety of the loft. The canteen felt impossibly heavy, a tangible anchor of his commitment. He sat in the darkness and ran the plan through his mind again and again, a desperate, silent rehearsal. He visualized every step, prying loose the plank at the back of the barn, the one he'd noticed was weak weeks ago, squeezing through the opening, staying low to the ground, using the shadows of the outbuildings as cover. He mapped a route in his head that would take him wide around the dogs to the northern fence line. He tried to anticipate the dangers, a restless horse, a sudden noise, the sharp pain of a stone under his bare foot. He pictured himself moving through the tall grass of the prairie, the ranch shrinking behind him. The North Star his only guide. He had to believe it was possible. The moon became his clock, its slow descent towards the western horizon marking the dwindling minutes of his captivity. He knew he needed its faint light to navigate the treacherous terrain of the yard, but he also needed the deep darkness that would follow its setting to conceal his escape across the open plains. The timing had to be perfect. The waiting was a unique form of agony, a drawn-out moment of suspense where every second felt like an hour. He listened to the night, to the chirping of crickets and the distant howl of a coyote, sounds that were once just the backdrop to his misery, but were now the soundtrack to his liberation. He pressed his forehead against the rough wood of the barn wall, the splinters digging into his skin, and focused on his breathing, trying to calm the frantic energy that surged through him. The moment arrived as the top edge of the moon finally touched the horizon, painting the distant hills in a soft, ethereal glow. It was time. There was no more planning, no more waiting. A final, powerful wave of doubt washed over him. He was just a boy, a barefoot, starving boy against a cruel man and an endless wilderness. It was madness. But then, as if on cue, the image of Abigail returned, not her face in the window, but her laughter. A sound he hadn't heard in so long it felt like a memory from another lifetime. That sound was the only answer he needed. He understood with perfect, searing clarity that staying was the true madness. Staying was a slow death. Fleeing, however impossible, was an act of life, an act of love. This was his point of no return. He would find his sister, or he would die in the trying. There was no other path. With his resolve hardened into something unbreakable, he moved to the back wall of the barn. His fingers found the edges of the loose plank. He took a deep breath and pulled. The wood groaned in protest, the sound of splintering fibers deafening in the profound silence. For a terrifying second, he froze, convinced the entire ranch must have heard. But there was only the sound of the wind. He pulled again, harder, and the plank came free in his hands. A narrow, dark opening appeared, a gateway to the world. He pushed the bread and canteen through first, then squeezed his thin body into the gap. The night air hit his face, cool and smelling of damp earth and wild sage. It was the scent of freedom. He was out. Crouching low in the deep shadow of the barn, he paused for a single heartbeat, then turned his face to the north and began to run. The night air was a shock, a sudden cold slap that tasted of dust and freedom. He moved from the suffocating warmth of the barn into the vast open chill of the Kansas prairie, and for a terrifying moment he felt completely exposed, as if every star in the sky were an eye trained directly on him. His body was a tightly coiled spring of pure adrenaline, every muscle screaming to run, to sprint into the darkness and never look back. But he forced himself into a low crouch, his movements slow and deliberate, a shadow detaching itself from a larger shadow. The first 10 feet of his journey were the most difficult, a silent battle between instinct and strategy, his heart hammering a frantic, desperate rhythm against the inside of his ribs, a drumbeat for his own private war of liberation. He was no longer a prisoner, but he was not yet free. He was a fugitive, and the world was a minefield. His first objective was the fence line that marked the northern edge of the property, a distant, skeletal line against the horizon. To get there, he had to cross the open yard, a pale, moon-drenched expanse of dirt and gravel that offered no cover. He moved in a series of short, agonizing bursts, his bare feet registering the sharp, cruel texture of the ground with searing clarity. Every small stone was a spike, every rough patch of earth a bed of hot coals. The pain was immediate and breathtaking, a fiery protest from the soles of his feet that traveled up his legs and settled as a hard, sick knot in his stomach. He bit down on the inside of his cheek, welcoming the sharp, coppery taste of blood as a distraction from the torment below. This was the price of his confiscated boots, a toll Kellerman was extracting with every single step Daniel took away from him. He reached the relative safety of the large water trough, its long shadow providing a precious sliver of concealment. He pressed his back against the cold, damp wood, his chest heaving as he fought to control his ragged breathing, each gasp sounding like a roar in the profound silence of the night. He risked a glance toward the kennel, a dark shape near the porch of the main house. He could just make out the forms of Kellerman's 2 dogs, a pair of dark, unmoving lumps. They were asleep. The knowledge did little to calm the frantic pounding in his chest. He knew their sleep was light, their ears attuned to the slightest unfamiliar sound. He was an intruder in their world, a foreign scent on the wind, and if they woke, it would all be over. He stayed there, frozen, listening, trying to become just another part of the night. Slowly, carefully, he began to move again, inching his way along the length of the trough. But his focus was so intent on the dogs, on the silent house, that he grew careless for a fraction of a second. The metal canteen, clutched tightly in his hand, scraped against a rusted iron band, circling the wooden trough. The sound was soft, a metallic rasp, but in the dead quiet of the ranch yard it seemed as loud as a gunshot. He froze instantly, his blood turning to ice in his veins. Every muscle in his body locked, and a wave of pure paralyzing terror washed over him. He was certain he had failed. He pictured the dogs leaping to their feet, their barks shattering the night. He pictured a lamp flaring to life in the house, the heavy sound of Kellerman's boots on the porch. He squeezed his eyes shut and waited for the end. Seconds stretched into an eternity. He held his breath until his lungs burned, his ears straining for any sign of discovery. He heard the wind whispering through the dry grass. He heard the distant, lonely cry of a coyote. Then, from the kennel, he heard a low whine, the sound of a dog stirring in its sleep, followed by the soft thump of a tail against the wooden floor. His heart stopped, but the barking never came. The dog settled, and the silence returned, deeper and more absolute than before. A wave of light-headed, nauseating relief washed over him, so intense it almost buckled his knees. He had been given a reprieve, a moment of pure, unearned luck. He understood then that his survival depended not just on his own caution, but on the whims of chance, a terrifying and humbling realization. He could not afford another mistake. The rest of the yard stretched before him, 100 feet of open, unforgiving ground. There was no more cover, no more shadows to hide in. Crossing it felt like stepping onto a brightly lit stage, his small, ragged form the only actor. He forced his legs to move, one painful, deliberate step at a time. His eyes were fixed on the northern fence line, a tangible goal in the overwhelming emptiness. The main house loomed to his right, a silent, sleeping monolith. He could feel its presence, could almost imagine Kellerman inside, his cruel dreams undisturbed. The thought sent a fresh jolt of fear through him, but it also fueled his determination. Every step he took was a victory, a small act of rebellion against the man who had tried to break him. He was walking away, and the simple act of putting one foot in front of the other was the most powerful statement he could make. The pain in his feet escalated from a sharp, intermittent agony to a constant, grinding torment. The initial cuts and bruises had become a network of raw, weeping sores. With every step he could feel the gravel and dirt grinding into the open flesh, a sensation that made him want to scream. He was leaving a trail, a faint, almost invisible trace of blood on the pale Kansas dirt. He tried to focus on something else, on anything else. He focused on the memory of Abigail's face, on the sound of her laughter, on the desperate promise he had made. Her image became a shield, a barrier between his consciousness and the overwhelming physical pain. He was walking for her, and that knowledge transformed the agony into a necessary sacrifice, a price he was willing to pay. He finally reached the fence, his hands touching the rough, weathered wood of a post with a sense of profound relief. But the relief was short-lived. The fence was barbed wire, 5 strands stretched taut and menacing, glinting faintly in the weak moonlight. It was taller than he had realized, too high to climb without shredding his hands and what was left of his thin shirt. A cold knot of panic began to form in his stomach. He had been so focused on escaping the barn and crossing the yard that he hadn't considered this final, formidable barrier. For a moment his resolve wavered. He was trapped, caught between the sleeping dogs behind him and the sharp, unyielding wire in front of him. Despair, cold and familiar, threatened to pull him under. He refused to surrender. He turned and began to move along the fence line, his hands brushing against the lowest strand of wire, searching for any sign of weakness, for any flaw in his prison wall. He walked for what felt like an eternity, the sharp barbs tearing at his fingertips. Then he found it. In a low-lying area where seasonal rains had eroded the earth, a shallow ditch had formed beneath the fence. The lowest strand of wire was stretched across it, leaving a gap of perhaps 1.5 feet. It was not a gate, but it was an opening. It was a chance. Hope, fierce and sharp, surged through him, pushing back the encroaching despair. He dropped to his knees, the sharp stones digging into his already battered skin, and knew this was his only way out. Getting down on his stomach, he felt the cold, damp earth against his cheek. The ground smelled of soil and wild sage, a primal scent that was both alien and comforting. He pushed the canteen and his small parcel of bread under the wire first, watching them slide into the tall grass on the other side. Then he began to inch his own body forward into the narrow gap. The space was tight, and the rough ground scraped his chest and stomach. He moved with agonizing slowness, his breath held tight in his chest. A barb on the wire above him snagged the back of his shirt, the sound of the fabric tearing a soft, ripping noise in the quiet. He froze, listening, then carefully wiggled free, the sharp metal point leaving a long, stinging scratch across his back. He was through. He was on the other side. He scrambled to his feet, emerging into the tall prairie grass that swayed gently in the night breeze. The grass felt like silk against his tortured feet, a blessedly soft carpet after the brutal terrain of the ranch yard. He stood there for a moment, his body trembling with a mixture of exhaustion, pain, and exhilaration. He turned and looked back one last time. The ranch was a collection of dark, silent shapes under the vast, starry sky. It looked small and insignificant from this distance. It was no longer his prison. It was just a place, a bad memory he was now leaving behind. The physical and emotional chains that had bound him to that place for 3 agonizing months had finally been broken. He turned his face to the north. The prairies stretched before him, an endless, rolling sea of darkness under a brilliant canopy of stars. The North Star, the one his father had taught him to find, burned with a steady, unwavering light, a single point of certainty in the vast, intimidating wilderness. He felt terrifyingly small and profoundly alone, a single fragile boy against the immense, indifferent landscape. The fear of Kellerman had been replaced by a new, more primal fear of the unknown, of the vast emptiness that lay ahead. But this fear was different. It was the fear that came with freedom, with the terrifying, exhilarating burden of choice. He took a deep, shuddering breath of the cool night air, shifted the weight of the canteen in his hand, and took his first real step into the wilderness, a step toward his sister. The initial rush of adrenaline began to recede, leaving in its place a bone-deep weariness and a sobering awareness of the journey's true scale. 140 miles. The number was an abstraction, a distance so vast it was almost impossible for his tired mind to comprehend. He knew he couldn't think about the destination. To do so would be to invite despair. He could only focus on the immediate task, putting one foot in front of the other. He had to survive the night and then the day that followed and the night after that. He found a slow, painful, shuffling rhythm, a gait that minimized the agony in his feet as much as possible. The sloshing of the water in his canteen was a small, comforting sound, a reminder that he was not entirely without resources. He was alone, he was injured, but he was moving. And for now, that was enough. After 6 days that felt like 6 lifetimes, the world began to change. The endless, monotonous prairie finally gave way to gentle rolling hills and small clusters of cottonwood trees lining the banks of a shallow creek. He was delirious, moving in a fugue state where the past and present blurred into a single painful continuum. His feet were no longer a part of him. They were just ruined things he dragged along, leaving a faint, dark trail in the dust. Then he saw it. Cresting a small rise, his vision swimming, he saw a speck of white in the distance. As he stumbled closer, the speck resolved itself into a house, a clean white farmhouse with a large orchard to its side, just as the drover had described. The sight was a physical shock, a jolt of pure, unadulterated hope that was so powerful it almost brought him to his knees. It was real. It wasn't a fever dream. He was here. That single thought propelled him forward, giving a final, desperate surge of strength to his ravaged body. He stumbled into the farmyard, the world tilting on a precarious axis. The air was thick with the scent of apple blossoms and dry, clean earth, a peaceful smell that felt like a cruel joke in the face of his own agony. His body, which had been running on the fumes of sheer will for the past 24 hours, finally gave out. His legs buckled, and he fell hard into the dust, the impact a dull, distant thud. For several long moments, he simply lay there, his cheek pressed against the warm ground, unable to move, unable to think. The silence of the place was overwhelming. It wasn't the menacing silence of Kellerman's ranch, or the empty silence of the prairie. It was a peaceful, settled quiet, the sound of a place that was cared for, a place that was a home. A frantic, desperate hope began to bubble up inside him, a dangerous and beautiful thing. He tried to call out her name, the one word that had been the singular focus of his entire existence for 3 months. But his throat was a dry, cracked riverbed, and all that emerged was a pathetic, rasping croak, a sound more animal than human. He pushed himself up onto his hands and knees, his body screaming in protest. Every muscle, every joint, every raw nerve ending was a point of exquisite pain. He was a creature of pure suffering, but his eyes were fixed on the house. He began to crawl, dragging his useless legs behind him, his progress marked by a slow, agonizing trail in the dust. He had to reach the porch. He had to find someone. He had to know. The world had shrunk to this single, desperate task, this final, excruciating effort to close the distance between himself and his sister. His eyes, blurred with exhaustion and unshed tears, scanned the property, drinking in the details of the place he had imagined for so many sleepless nights. He saw the neatly stacked firewood, the clean panes of glass in the windows, the vibrant green of a well-tended vegetable garden. It was a place of order, of life, of peace. It was everything the tenement and the ranch were not. It was a haven. The hope inside him swelled, so large and powerful it felt like it might burst from his chest. He allowed himself to imagine it just for a second. Abigail, running out of that white house, her face breaking into a smile when she saw him. The vision was so vivid, so desperately wanted, that it felt more real than the pain that was consuming him. He was so close. Then his gaze drifted to the orchard. The apple trees were in full glorious bloom, a canopy of white flowers against the brilliant blue of the Kansas sky. It was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. But his attention was snagged by something at the edge of the orchard, something that didn't fit the idyllic picture. Beneath a tree laden with blossoms, there was a small patch of freshly turned soil. It was neat and rectangular, the earth a darker, richer color than the surrounding ground. A cold, heavy dread began to uncoil in the pit of his stomach, a feeling far worse than the physical torment he had endured. His mind recoiled from the implication, trying to find another explanation, any other explanation for what he was seeing. A simple wooden cross, no bigger than his forearm, was pushed into the center of the dark earth. It was stark and unadorned, yet it was clear it had been made with care. Even from a distance, through the shimmering heat and the haze of his own failing vision, he could see that something had been carved into the wood. He stopped crawling, his body frozen. The beautiful, treacherous hope that had surged through him only moments before now curdled into a thick, suffocating poison. He knew, with a certainty that was absolute and soul-destroying, what he was looking at. The world stopped. The buzzing of insects, the whisper of the wind, the frantic beating of his own heart. It all went silent. There was only that small patch of earth and the terrible, silent statement it was making. He had to be sure. The need to know, to see the final, irrefutable proof, was a primal urge that overrode everything else. He began to move again, dragging himself forward, his eyes locked on that simple wooden cross. The journey of the last few yards was the longest and most difficult of his entire life. The farmyard, which had seemed a haven just a minute ago, now felt like a desolate wasteland. The scent of the apple blossoms, once so sweet and full of life, now seemed cloying and funereal. He was moving toward the end of his world, and he was doing it on his hands and knees, a pilgrim crawling toward a devastating, unholy relic. He could feel his sanity fraying, the thin thread of his resolve about to snap. He reached the edge of the turned soil and collapsed, his arms outstretched. His trembling fingers hovered over the letters carved into the cross, not daring to make contact, as if touching them would make the nightmare irrevocably real. He forced his eyes to focus, to read the name, Abigail, her name, the name that had been his compass, his prayer, his reason to endure the unendurable. Seeing it there, etched into a piece of wood planted in the ground, did not just break his heart, it vaporized it, turning every memory, every promise, every agonizing step of his journey into a fine gray ash that settled in his lungs, making it impossible to breathe. The world dissolved into a meaningless blur of white blossoms and blue sky. And this is the moment where our story began. This is the quiet farmyard where we first met Daniel Tobias Ashworth. This was the end of his 140-mile pilgrimage, a journey fueled by a love so powerful it had defied starvation, cruelty, and the vast, indifferent wilderness of the prairie. The hope that had been a defiant, raging fire inside him, that had burned through the cold and the pain and the fear, was finally and utterly extinguished by the devastating silence of a grave. He collapsed right there, his face buried in the Kansas dust that now covered his sister, his journey over, his promise met with the most final and heartbreaking of answers. Just then a sound cut through his all-consuming grief, the soft creak of a screen door opening on the porch of the white farmhouse. A woman stepped out, her face framed by graying hair, her eyes filled with a deep, weary kindness. She saw the ragged, broken boy weeping uncontrollably over the small, fresh grave, and her expression shifted from startled surprise to a look of profound, knowing sorrow. She didn't rush forward or call out. She simply stood there, a silent witness, as if she had been half expecting this very moment, as if she understood that the boy who had just arrived was not a stranger, but the other half of a story that had ended far too soon. He did not remember being moved. The world had dissolved into a grey, soundless void after he read his sister's name, and he had simply ceased to exist within it. His next sensation was of being lifted, a surprising strength cradling his wasted frame. He was carried from the harsh sunlight of the yard into the cool, dim interior of the house. The air inside was a different world, smelling of baked bread, dried lavender, and wood smoke, a trinity of scents so fundamentally comforting it felt like a violation of his grief. He was laid gently on a soft surface, a cot in a small, quiet room, and a man's voice, low and steady, murmured something he couldn't understand. This was Thomas Whitmore, a man whose face was etched with the lines of hard work and a quiet, profound decency. Daniel registered his presence not as a threat, but as a force of calm in the swirling chaos of his shattered mind. The woman, Martha, came to him a short time later. She didn't press him with questions or offer empty platitudes. She simply sat in a wooden chair beside the cot, her hands folded in her lap, her presence a quiet, patient vigil. She brought a glass of cool water, holding it to his lips, and he drank without thinking, the liquid a shock of life against his parched throat. He was catatonic, a hollowed-out shell of a boy, his eyes fixed on a patch of light on the far wall. He was aware of her kindness in a distant, detached way, like watching a scene from a play. He had completed his journey only to find it was meaningless, and his mind had erected a wall between himself and the unbearable reality. He was a traveler who had reached the end of the world, only to find nothing there but an abyss. After what felt like an eternity of silence, Martha began to speak, her voice soft and even, narrating the story he had come so far to find. She told him of the day the Orphan train had stopped, of the small, pale girl with a deep, rattling cough who had stepped onto the platform. She spoke of Abigail's quiet bravery, of her fierce, unwavering insistence that her brother, Daniel, would be coming for her. The Whitmores had taken her in not as a laborer, but as a daughter they had prayed for, their own 2 children having grown and moved away. They had seen the sickness in her, but they had also seen the unshakable spirit, the fierce loyalty that burned in her eyes. She described how they had brought her to this house, to this very room, and had spent every waking moment trying to nurse her back to health, fighting a fever that had already taken too deep a root. She painted a picture of Abigail's final 3 weeks, not as a period of suffering, but as a time of quiet peace. She described how Abigail would sit by the window, watching the northern road, never doubting for a single moment that he would appear on the horizon. She spoke of the girl's fascination with the apple orchard, how she loved the way the sunlight filtered through the leaves, and how she had made Martha promise that if she couldn't get better, she could be laid to rest there, under the prettiest tree. Martha's voice broke slightly as she recounted this, the memory still fresh and painful. Daniel listened, the words seeping slowly through the thick fog of his grief, each detail a small agonizing pinprick of light in his immense darkness. He began to understand that his sister had not been alone or afraid in her final days. The Whitmores had done everything they could. They had summoned the doctor from town, they had fed her warm broth and sweet milk, and they had read to her from the Bible each night. Thomas had carved her a small wooden bird, which she kept clutched in her hand until the very end. They had loved her. The simple, undeniable truth of it was a seismic shock to Daniel's system. In a world that had shown him nothing but cruelty and indifference since the fire, a world where children were treated as commodities, these strangers had offered his sister unconditional love. They had given her the home, the safety, and the tenderness that he had been so desperately trying to reach. The knowledge was both a comfort and a fresh source of unbearable pain. Martha then rose from her chair and went to a small wooden chest in the corner of the room. From it, she retrieved a single piece of paper, folded into a neat, small square, the edges softened with handling. She returned to his bedside and held it out to him. Her eyes were filled with a sorrow that mirrored his own. She explained that a few days before the end, when Abigail knew her time was short, she had dictated a letter. She had made Martha write down her exact words, her voice a weak but determined whisper. The letter, she had insisted, was for Daniel, because he was coming. She knew he was coming. Martha placed the folded paper into his trembling hand. It felt impossibly heavy, the weight of his sister's final thoughts, a last message sent across the veil of death. His fingers fumbled with the paper, his movements clumsy and uncoordinated. Unfolding it felt like a sacred act, a desecration of something holy. The paper was cheap and thin, and the handwriting was a woman's neat, careful script. But the words on the page were his sister's. They were addressed simply, "To Daniel." He began to read, his eyes struggling to focus through a fresh wave of tears that now blurred his vision. The letter was short, written in the simple, direct language of a child. She told him not to be sad. She wrote about Martha's kindness, about the taste of sweet milk and about the beautiful apple tree outside her window. She described the little wooden bird Mr. Thomas had made for her. Each word was a testament to the peace she had found in this place. She wrote of her unwavering faith in him. She said that every day she had watched the road, and that even when her body grew tired, her heart knew he was walking toward her. She told him that she wasn't scared, because she knew that the love they shared was bigger than the distance between them, bigger even than sickness. She had felt his presence, she wrote, as surely as if he were holding her hand. The words were not an accusation or a lament. They were a declaration of absolute, unconditional faith. He had been her hero, her protector, until the very end. She had never for a single moment believed he had abandoned her, had never lost hope in the promise he had made. Then he reached the final lines, the words that would forever alter the landscape of his soul. She had written, "I know you will come, I always knew, I love you, Abby." Reading those words, Daniel felt something inside him shatter. But it was not a breaking of despair. It was the breaking of a dam, releasing a flood of emotion so powerful it threatened to drown him. The terrible, crushing weight of his perceived failure, the guilt that had been his constant companion, was lifted in an instant. His journey had not been in vain. He had not been too late. He had arrived exactly when she knew he would. His purpose had not been to save her from death, but to fulfill her faith. And he had. He clutched the letter to his chest, the thin paper crinkling against his shirt. A sound escaped his throat, a raw, ragged sob that was part grief, part relief, and part a gratitude so profound it had no name. He wept. He wept for the sister he had lost, for the parents he barely remembered, for the brutalized, terrified boy who had walked across 140 miles of hell. But these were not the silent, hopeless tears he had shed at the grave. This was a cleansing, a catharsis, a torrent of emotion that washed away the bitterness and left behind a strange, aching peace. He had not failed her. In the only way that truly mattered, he had made it home. The letter was a key, unlocking a new understanding of his entire ordeal. His 6-day walk was not a tragic pilgrimage that ended in failure, but a testament to a bond that death itself could not sever. The grave under the apple tree was no longer a monument to his loss, but a symbol of the love and peace his sister had found. It was the destination he had been seeking all along, though he hadn't known it. It was a place of rest, not just for her but for him. The kindness of the Whitmores, the words of the letter, the quiet dignity of her final resting place, this was the true refuge. It was the proof that he had not been alone in his love for her, that in her final moments she had been protected and cherished by others. He finally understood. The promise was not about a physical reunion. It was about memory, about faith, about a love that refused to be extinguished by fire or distance or cruelty. He had carried his love for her across the plains, a single flickering candle in a vast, dark wilderness. And here, in this quiet room, he had found that she had been carrying her love for him just as fiercely. Their promises had met, not in a happy embrace, but in a shared, unspoken understanding that transcended the boundaries of life and death. He had found her, he had kept his promise, and in doing so, he had found the first tentative seeds of his own salvation. He must have fallen asleep then, an exhausted, dreamless slumber brought on by the complete depletion of his physical and emotional reserves. When he awoke, the light in the room had softened, casting long shadows across the floor. The letter was still clutched in his hand, a permanent part of him now. For the first time in 3 months, the frantic, gnawing anxiety that had been his constant companion was gone. In its place was a vast, quiet sorrow, but it was a clean sorrow, a grief he could carry. He was no longer running from a nightmare. He was standing in the quiet aftermath, and he knew with a certainty that settled deep in his bones that he would survive. The story of Horace Kellerman's cruelty did not end in the silence of the prairie. The day after Daniel's arrival, Thomas Whitmore, his face set in a grim, determined line, saddled his horse and rode the long journey to Dodge City. He was not a man given to idle threats or loud pronouncements, but his quiet resolve was as unyielding as the Kansas earth. He walked into the marshal's office and laid out the entire story, his words measured and clear, detailing the state in which he had found the boy and the tale of abuse Daniel had recounted. He spoke not with outrage, but with the cold, hard certainty of a man reporting a fundamental violation of human decency, a crime against God and man that could not be allowed to stand. The marshal, a man who had seen his share of frontier brutality, listened intently. The name Kellerman was not unknown to him. The rancher was a man who kept to himself, but whispers had always followed him, rumors of a temper as vast and merciless as his land holdings. Thomas Whitmore's testimony was the first concrete accusation, and it was enough. An investigation was launched, and what it uncovered was a history of darkness far worse than Daniel had ever imagined. Over the course of a decade, 4 other orphan boys, sent west for a better life, had been assigned to Kellerman's ranch. Each one had, according to the rancher, simply run off. None had ever been seen or heard from again. Kellerman was arrested. His ranch, built on the suffering of forgotten children, was seized, and the man who had seen Daniel as nothing more than an animal was finally forced to face a justice he had long evaded. For Daniel, the news was not a cause for celebration, but a quiet, solemn closing of a chapter. The monster from his past had been caged. This act of justice, initiated by a good man he barely knew, was another piece of the puzzle falling into place. It was more proof that the world was not entirely composed of cruelty and indifference. There was kindness, there was decency, and there were people who would stand up for a boy who had no one else to stand for him. Thomas and Martha Whitmore did not see Daniel as a burden or a temporary ward. In the quiet, broken boy, they saw the brother of the girl they had briefly but fiercely loved. They saw a survivor who deserved a chance at the life that had been stolen from him. In a simple proceeding before a circuit judge, they formally adopted him. Daniel Tobias Ashworth, a boy who had been an orphan, a vagabond, and a slave, was given a new name and a new family. He was given a home. He was given a place to heal, surrounded by the quiet rhythm of farm life, the steady kindness of his new parents, and the comforting presence of the apple orchard where his sister rested. He chose to stay, to build his life in the only place she had ever found peace. He never left Cottonwood Falls. As he grew from a boy into a man, the scars on his body faded, but the memory of his journey and the words of his sister's letter became the bedrock of his character. He learned to work the land, his hands growing strong and capable, but his heart remained gentle. At the age of 23, he did not take over the farm, but instead became the town's new schoolteacher. He found his purpose not in tilling the soil, but in cultivating the minds and protecting the spirits of children, especially those who, like him, knew what it was to be vulnerable. He became the guardian he had always tried to be for his sister, his classroom a sanctuary against the harshness of the world. He married a woman from town and built a small house not far from the Whitmore farmstead. They had 4 children of their own, and he named his eldest daughter Abigail. He raised his children with a deep, unwavering tenderness, ensuring they never for a moment doubted they were loved and safe. Every spring, when the apple trees in the old orchard burst into a riot of white blossoms, he would take them to the small weathered wooden cross that still stood beneath the largest tree. He would sit with them in the soft grass and tell them the story of a long walk, of a promise between a brother and a sister. He would tell them that a promise is never truly broken, not even by death, because finding the person you love, even if only in memory, is worth every single step of the journey.